Picture this. It's 7 in the evening at the most exclusive venue in Harborview, Maine, and you're standing in your dress whites watching your father accept applause from 150 of New England's most powerful people. He's talking about legacy, about family values, about building something that matters. And then he sees you standing near the bar, and his expression shifts to something between pity and embarrassment. He leans into the microphone and says, with that practiced chuckle that always gets laughs from his crowd, "My daughter Victoria is here tonight too, still playing sailor. We keep hoping she'll come to her senses and join the real world, but you know how stubborn kids can be. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." The room laughs. Polite, knowing laughter that says they understand what it's like to have a child who disappoints. Your mother touches your father's arm with that gentle correction gesture she's perfected over 30 years, but she's smiling too. Your brother Marcus raises his champagne glass in your direction with a smirk that communicates everything he's always thought about your choices. The yacht club crowd, dressed in their summer whites and navy blazers, goes back to their conversations about quarterly earnings and vacation properties, dismissing you as easily as they dismissed the waitstaff circulating with appetizers. But here's what none of them know. Standing 15 feet behind you, silent and observing, is Commander Nathan Cross, a Navy SEAL whose chest carries enough ribbons and medals to fill a display case. He's flanked by 3 other officers whose combined combat experience spans 4 decades and 7 countries. They've been watching this entire performance, and the expressions on their faces have shifted from professional courtesy to something much harder and more dangerous. In exactly 12 minutes, when your father invites distinguished guests to say a few words about his remarkable career, Commander Cross is going to walk to that microphone. And what he says next won't just silence this room. It will detonate 30 years of carefully constructed family mythology and expose a pattern of dismissal so systematic, so cruel, that some of these people will never look at Richard Brennan the same way again. By the time this evening ends, your father won't be accepting congratulations. He'll be offering apologies that can never undo the damage. The brother who mocked your service will be frantically Googling your actual rank to understand how badly he miscalculated. And your mother, who spent 3 decades prioritizing appearances over truth, will finally have to confront what her choices cost. This isn't just a story about a military career your family never respected. This is about the moment when silence becomes testimony, when hidden achievements become public record, and when the child they underestimated reveals she was never the one who needed to prove anything. What happened that night at the Harborview Yacht Club didn't just shift power in my family. It exposed a cycle of favoritism and dismissal that had been poisoning our relationship since I was old enough to disappoint my father by being born female. This is my story, and I promise you've never heard anything quite like it. My name is Victoria and Brennan, though most people who've served with me call me Tori. At 34, I'm the walking contradiction of everything my family believes about success, respectability, and what it means to build a meaningful life. While my brother Marcus was collecting his law degree from Harvard and joining Brennan family friends at a white shoe Boston firm that handles maritime contracts for Fortune 500 companies, I was completing my 3rd deployment to places whose names remain classified. While my mother Patricia was hosting charity luncheons for the Coastal Heritage Society and photographing herself with senators' wives for the society pages, I was leading teams through situations that would give her nightmares if she had any real understanding of what modern warfare actually involves. The evening of my father's retirement gala had been marked on my family's calendar for 8 months. Richard Brennan's departure from active leadership of Brennan Logistics, the maritime shipping company his grandfather founded in 1952, was being treated with the kind of reverence usually reserved for royal coronations or papal transitions. The event wasn't just a party. It was a statement about legacy, about the Brennan family's 3 generations of dominance in New England shipping, about the careful cultivation of relationships with politicians, business leaders, and old money families whose ancestors arrived on these shores when the concept of American independence was still being debated in taverns. The Harborview Yacht Club sits on a peninsula that juts into the Atlantic like a declaration of privilege. The main building is a masterpiece of New England maritime architecture, all weathered cedar shingles and white trim, with floor-to-ceiling windows that frame views of the harbor where million-dollar sailboats bob at their moorings like expensive toys. The club has maintained its exclusivity since 1887 through a membership process so selective that having money is merely the entry fee. What really matters is lineage, connections, and the kind of social pedigree that can't be purchased but must be inherited or married into over generations. My family had been members since my great-grandfather's time, when the Brennan shipping business was just beginning to transition from coastal freight to international logistics. The club's walls were lined with photographs documenting over a century of regattas, Commodore balls, and formal dinners where deals worth millions were negotiated over brandy and cigars in rooms where women were still prohibited until the 1970s. My father loved this place with the kind of passion he'd never shown toward his children, because here his success was validated by people whose opinions he actually valued. I'd driven up from Portsmouth Naval Shipyard that afternoon, making the 90-minute journey in my personal vehicle rather than anything that might indicate my actual status or position. The dress white uniform I wore was impeccably maintained, every ribbon and device positioned with the precision that becomes second nature after 16 years of service. But to anyone at the yacht club who bothered to look, which wasn't many, I appeared to be exactly what my father had always described me as, a mid-level naval officer who'd chosen a respectable but ultimately unremarkable career path that would never approach the prestige or financial rewards of my brother's legal practice. The careful anonymity was intentional. For the past 6 months, since receiving the promotion that changed everything, I'd been operating under protocols that required discretion about my actual rank and position. The nature of my work, the units I commanded, and the operations I oversaw were classified at levels that meant even my family couldn't access accurate information about what I actually did for the Navy. That classification had created a convenient shield that allowed my father to construct whatever narrative he preferred about my career, filling in the gaps in his knowledge with assumptions that matched his preconceptions about women in military service and the limited possibilities available to someone who disappointed him by not joining the family business. When I walked into the yacht club's main ballroom at 6:30 that evening, the space was already filling with the kind of crowd my father had spent his entire adult life cultivating. I recognized faces from the society pages and business journals. There was Senator Whitmore, whose committee oversight included naval appropriations, chatting easily with my father near the bar. Beside him stood Maxwell Chen, CEO of a shipping conglomerate that competed directly with Brennan Logistics, apparently comfortable enough to attend his rival's retirement celebration because that's how business works at this level. Everyone competes professionally but socializes cordially, maintaining relationships that transcend whatever market battles they might be fighting in boardrooms and contract negotiations. My mother spotted me immediately, her expression cycling through relief that I'd actually shown up, assessment of whether my uniform met her standards for the occasion, and subtle disappointment that I hadn't worn something more feminine that might help me attract the kind of husband she'd been hoping I'd find since my 20s. Patricia Brennan had never understood my choice to attend the Naval Academy instead of following my brother to an Ivy League school where I might have met appropriate young men from appropriate families. In her worldview, the military was something that enlisted people did because they lacked better options, not a calling that someone from our background would pursue when perfectly good alternatives existed. She glided across the polished floor with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of looking elegant while simultaneously managing social situations. Her silk dress was the color of champagne, chosen specifically to photograph well and coordinate with the club's nautical color scheme. Every detail of her appearance had been calculated for maximum impact, from the pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother to the subtle highlights in her auburn hair that her stylist refreshed every 3 weeks. "Victoria, darling, you made it," she said, her voice carrying that particular blend of warmth and evaluation that had characterized most of our interactions since I'd disappointed her by choosing Annapolis over Wellesley. "Your father was worried you might not be able to get leave. You know how important tonight is to him, celebrating everything he's built and finally getting to enjoy retirement after all these years of running the company." The gentle reprimand was embedded in her welcome, as always. The implication that my military service was something I could simply set aside for family obligations, that requesting leave was a matter of convenience rather than a process governed by operational requirements and chain of command considerations she'd never bothered to understand. She'd been making these small dismissive comments about my career for 16 years, each one individually negligible but collectively constructing a narrative that my choices were somehow less valid than Marcus's path through law school and corporate practice. I managed a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I wouldn't have missed it, Mother. Where's Marcus?" She brightened immediately, the way she always did when conversation turned to my brother. "Oh, he's here somewhere, probably networking. You know how he is, always making connections. He just made junior partner at the firm, did I tell you? Youngest in the practice's history. Your father is so proud. He's everything we hoped he'd become." The comparison hung in the air between us, unspoken but unmistakable. Marcus was everything they'd hoped for. Which meant I wasn't. The equation had been that simple since we were children, since it became clear that my brother possessed the charm and ambition my father valued, while I was more interested in charts and navigation than in cultivating relationships with the children of my parents' social circle. I spotted Marcus holding court near the windows overlooking the harbor, surrounded by a cluster of young professionals who laughed at his stories with the enthusiasm of people who understood he was destined for influence and wanted to be remembered as early supporters. He was 31 but looked older in the way that successful young lawyers often do, his appearance carefully calibrated to project authority and competence. The custom suit probably cost more than 3 months of my base pay, and the watch glinting on his wrist was the kind of statement piece that communicated success to people who measured such things. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He saw me watching and excused himself from his admirers, crossing the room with the confident stride of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. His smile was broad and apparently genuine, though I'd learned long ago to recognize the calculation behind my brother's displays of affection. Well, if it isn't Lieutenant Brennan," he said, emphasizing my rank in a way that made it sound diminutive rather than respectable. "Still fighting the good fight on the high seas? Or are you stuck behind a desk now, pushing paperwork around some forgotten naval installation?" The dismissal in his tone was casual, almost friendly, which somehow made it worse than if he'd been openly hostile. To Marcus, my entire career was a curiosity, something vaguely admirable in an abstract way but ultimately inferior to his own trajectory through the halls of power where real influence was exercised and real money was made. He'd never understood why someone with my intelligence and our family's connections would choose military service over opportunities in business or law where those advantages could be properly leveraged. "Something like that," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "How's the partnership treating you?" He launched into a detailed account of his recent cases, the important clients he was representing, the deals he was structuring that would solidify Brennan Logistics' position in emerging markets. He talked about strategy sessions with my father, about conversations with potential investors, about the future of the family business that I'd abandoned by choosing the Navy over joining the firm. Every word reinforced the narrative that had defined our relationship since childhood. Marcus was the heir, the golden child whose achievements reflected perfectly on our parents' success at raising a son who embodied their values. I was the puzzle piece that didn't quite fit, tolerated but never celebrated, present at family events but always slightly peripheral to the real relationships and conversations that mattered. Our conversation was interrupted by the sound of crystal being tapped with a knife, the traditional signal that formal remarks were about to begin. The crowd gradually quieted and turned toward the small stage at the far end of the ballroom where my father stood beside the club's commodore. Richard Brennan looked every inch the successful businessman celebrating a career well lived. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his custom tuxedo fit him like it had been painted on, and his expression radiated the confident satisfaction of someone who'd built something significant and was now ready to enjoy the fruits of decades of strategic planning and hard work. The Commodore's introduction was effusive, cataloging my father's contributions to the shipping industry, his service on various boards and committees, his generous donations to causes that mattered to the yacht club community. He spoke about the Brennan family legacy, about 3 generations of maritime excellence, about the respect Richard commanded among his peers. The crowd responded with warm applause, and I found myself clapping mechanically along with everyone else while simultaneously feeling the familiar disconnect that had characterized most of my family interactions for as long as I could remember. Then my father took the microphone, and his opening remarks followed the expected pattern. He thanked the Commodore, acknowledged the presence of various dignitaries and business partners, made self-deprecating jokes about finally having time to actually sail the yacht he'd been too busy to use properly. The crowd laughed at the appropriate moments, and I could see my mother beaming with pride from her position near the front, exactly where she belonged in the carefully choreographed performance of their perfect life. But then his eyes found me standing toward the back of the room, and something shifted in his expression. Not hostility exactly, but something closer to bemusement mixed with mild embarrassment. He paused, and the room's attention followed his gaze until 150 pairs of eyes were focused on me in my dress whites, standing alone while everyone else was clustered in conversational groups. "I see my daughter Victoria is here tonight," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of indulgent exasperation that parents use when discussing children who've made peculiar life choices. "Still serving in the Navy, still dedicated to her career path even though we keep hoping she'll come to her senses and consider joining something more substantial. But you know how it is with kids these days. They have to find their own way, even if that way doesn't quite match what their parents had envisioned." The room responded with knowing chuckles and sympathetic nods. Several people glanced in my direction with expressions that ranged from polite curiosity to mild pity, as if I were a well-meaning but misguided young woman who'd eventually realize her mistake and come around to a more sensible career path. My mother's smile had frozen on her face, caught between pride in her husband's speech and discomfort at having my life choices publicly categorized as a source of mild family disappointment. "Marcus, now," my father continued, his voice warming as he shifted to his preferred topic. Marcus understood what it meant to carry on a family legacy. "He's making us proud every day, building on what 3 generations of Brennans have created. That's what matters, having children who understand the value of what their parents built and who are willing to dedicate themselves to something bigger than their own interests." The contrast was explicit and brutal. Marcus was the success story, the validation of my parents' approach to child rearing and their values. I was the asterisk, the child who'd somehow missed the message about what actually mattered. The room's energy shifted palpably toward my brother, who accepted the attention with practiced humility that didn't quite mask his satisfaction at being publicly designated the favorite child in front of 150 of our community's most influential people. I felt my face flush with a combination of anger and humiliation that I'd experienced countless times before but never quite became immune to. This was my father's retirement celebration, his moment to bask in professional achievements and personal satisfaction, and he'd chosen to use it as yet another opportunity to diminish my choices and elevate my brother's. The message was clear to everyone in the room. One Brennan child had succeeded. The other had not. But then I noticed movement near the entrance to the ballroom. 4 figures in naval dress uniforms had entered quietly during my father's speech, positioning themselves along the back wall where they could observe without interrupting. Even from a distance, I could see the insignia and ribbons that marked them as senior officers whose service records would be impressive by any standard. The lead figure was Commander Nathan Cross, whose face I'd recognize anywhere despite not having worked directly under his command. Behind him stood Captain Helen Whitmore, who'd been my commanding officer during my first significant deployment and who'd written one of the recommendation letters that changed everything about my career trajectory. They weren't here by accident. They weren't here as casual guests who happened to have connections to the yacht club's social scene. They were here because I'd asked them to come, because 6 months ago when everything changed, I'd begun planning for this exact moment when my family's dismissal would finally meet documented reality. The evidence I'd been gathering wasn't just professional records and service files. It was the physical presence of people whose opinions actually mattered in the world I'd chosen, witnesses who could testify to truths my family had never bothered to investigate because they'd already decided what narrative they preferred. My father had returned to his prepared remarks, talking about his plans for retirement and his gratitude for the relationships that had sustained him throughout his career. The room's attention had shifted back to him fully, everyone focused on the man of the hour as he built toward his closing thoughts. Nobody except me seemed to have noticed the naval officers who'd entered, or if they had noticed, they dismissed them as generic military presence that wasn't particularly relevant to the evening's main event. But I could see Commander Cross checking his watch with the precision timing that special operations personnel develop through years of missions where seconds matter. I could see Captain Whitmore positioning herself closer to the stage, her expression neutral but her body language suggesting someone preparing to take action. The other officers had fanned out slightly, creating a formation that subtly controlled the room's flow without being obvious about it. My father was approaching his conclusion, thanking everyone for their presence and their friendship, expressing his excitement about the next chapter of his life. The speech had been well crafted and perfectly delivered, exactly the kind of performance that had made Richard Brennan successful in business and respected in social circles. He'd hit every expected note, acknowledged every important relationship, and positioned himself as someone whose legacy would endure beyond his active career. And then, just as he was preparing to invite distinguished guests to share their own remarks, Commander Cross stepped forward from his position along the wall. His movement was measured and deliberate, the kind of approach that draws attention through sheer presence rather than drama. My father noticed him immediately, his expression shifting to confusion as he tried to place this uniformed figure who was clearly senior enough to command respect but whose presence at a private retirement party required explanation. The commander reached the base of the stage and waited, his posture radiating the kind of authority that comes from years of leading people in situations where leadership literally means the difference between life and death. The room had gone quiet again, sensing that something unexpected was unfolding but not yet understanding what it meant or why this interruption to the evening's planned program was occurring. My father leaned slightly toward the microphone, his businessman's instinct for managing awkward situations kicking in. "Can I help you, Commander? I'm afraid this is a private event, though we certainly appreciate your service." Commander Cross's expression didn't change. His voice, when he spoke, carried easily through the ballroom's excellent acoustics, reaching every corner of the space where New England's elite had gathered to celebrate what they thought they understood about success and family legacy. "Mr. Brennan, I apologize for the interruption, but there's something you and your guests need to understand about Lieutenant Brennan before this evening continues. Something that apparently hasn't been properly communicated to your family despite being a matter of public record within the Naval Service." He turned slightly, his gaze finding me in the crowd, and for the first time that evening, I felt something other than the familiar weight of family disappointment. I felt the stirring of vindication that comes when truth finally gets its moment after years of being suppressed by more convenient narratives. The commander's next words would shatter everything my father thought he knew about his disappointing daughter and transform this retirement celebration into something none of these people would ever forget. The silence in the Harborview Yacht Club ballroom stretched like pulled taffy, thick and uncomfortable. Commander Cross stood at the base of the stage with the kind of stillness that comes from years of maintaining composure in situations far more dangerous than a roomful of uncomfortable civilians. My father's hand remained frozen on the microphone, his expression caught between irritation at the interruption and uncertainty about how to gracefully manage this unexpected deviation from his carefully planned evening. Commander Cross's voice cut through the tension with surgical precision. "Mr. Brennan, you've spent this evening talking about legacy and what it means to build something meaningful. You've expressed disappointment that your daughter chose military service over joining your shipping business. But I don't think you actually understand what your daughter has been doing for the past 16 years, or what she's achieved in that time." My father's face cycled through several expressions, landing on something between patronizing patience and defensive pride. "Commander, I appreciate the sentiment, but I'm quite familiar with my daughter's career. She's a lieutenant in the Navy, stationed at Portsmouth doing administrative work. It's respectable service, certainly, but not quite the same as building a multi-generational business empire or practicing law at one of Boston's most prestigious firms." The commander's eyebrow lifted slightly, and I saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. The kind of look that people who've never been in actual combat don't recognize but that makes every hair on the back of your neck stand up if you've spent time in operational environments. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather folder, the kind used for official documentation, and opened it with deliberate care. "Sir, with respect, your information appears to be significantly outdated. What you're describing might have been accurate a decade ago, but it bears no resemblance to Lieutenant Commander Brennan's current status or responsibilities." The shift in my rank was subtle but it rippled through the room like a depth charge. "Lieutenant Commander. Not Lieutenant." 2 ranks higher than what my father had just claimed, and more importantly, a field-grade officer rank that indicated command responsibility and significant operational experience. I watched my mother's face go pale as she tried to process this new information, her mind clearly working through the implications of having been wrong about something she'd stated as fact to countless friends and acquaintances over the years. Marcus had gone very still, the confidence that usually animated his features draining away as he began to understand that something fundamental about his understanding of our family dynamic was being challenged. He'd built his entire self-image on being the successful child, the one who'd made our parents proud while I'd chosen a less impressive path. The foundation of that identity was beginning to crack, and I could see him struggling to maintain equilibrium. Commander Cross continued, his voice steady and factual, the tone of someone presenting evidence rather than making arguments. Lieutenant Commander Brennan graduated from the Naval Academy 16 years ago, fourth in her class of over 1,000 midshipmen. She received the Superintendent's Award for Academic Excellence and the Naval Institute Prize for Outstanding Scholarship in Naval Operations. Her thesis on asymmetric warfare tactics in littoral environments was classified and incorporated into current fleet doctrine. Those aren't accomplishments that get mentioned in polite society, Mr. Brennan, because most of your social circle lacks the security clearance to even know they exist. The yacht club crowd had gone absolutely silent. These were people accustomed to measuring success through visible markers like prestigious schools, high-paying jobs, and social connections. The idea that significant achievements might exist outside their sphere of awareness, in classified spaces they couldn't access or evaluate, was clearly disorienting. I could see them looking at me with new uncertainty, trying to reconcile the daughter who'd been dismissed as choosing a lesser path with this emerging picture of someone operating at levels they couldn't properly assess. My father had released the microphone and taken a step back, his face pale under the ballroom's elegant lighting. He looked like a man who'd just realized he'd been speaking with complete confidence about a subject he didn't actually understand, in front of an audience whose respect he valued above almost everything else in his life. The humiliation was visible in the rigid set of his shoulders and the way his hands had clenched into fists at his sides. Captain Whitmore had moved forward to stand beside Commander Cross, her presence adding additional authority to the unfolding revelation. She was a striking woman in her late 40s, her uniform decorated with ribbons that told a story of deployments and commendations spanning nearly 3 decades of service. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of calm certainty that comes from having nothing to prove and no patience for social games. After the Naval Academy, Lieutenant Commander Brennan attended Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, where she earned a master's degree in strategic studies with a focus on maritime security operations. She was then selected for the Olmsted Scholar Program, one of only 12 officers chosen from the entire military that year to receive fully funded graduate education at a foreign institution. She spent 2 years at King's College London completing a second master's degree in war studies while simultaneously serving as a liaison officer to British naval intelligence. My mother had sunk into the nearest chair, her champagne-colored dress suddenly seeming too bright for her ashen face. I could see her mind working frantically, trying to remember how many times she'd casually dismissed my career to friends at charity luncheons or country club dinners. How many conversations where she'd steered talk away from my service and toward Marcus's legal victories. How many photographs posted to social media that featured my brother's achievements prominently while barely mentioning my existence beyond a perfunctory acknowledgement that I was stationed somewhere doing something vaguely military-related. Commander Cross had taken over again, and his methodical recitation of facts was more devastating than any emotional appeal could have been. Upon completing her second master's degree, Lieutenant Commander Brennan was assigned to Naval Special Warfare Command, where she spent 3 years in operational billets supporting SEAL team deployments in theaters I'm not authorized to specify in this setting. During that time, she was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor Device for actions during a classified operation that I can only say involved the successful extraction of intelligence assets under hostile fire. She was 28 years old when she received that commendation, making her one of the youngest female officers in Navy history to be recognized for combat valor. The room had shifted from uncomfortable silence to something approaching shock. Bronze Stars aren't participation trophies. They're serious combat decorations awarded for heroic or meritorious achievement in connection with operations against an enemy. The Valor device, indicated by a small bronze V affixed to the ribbon, specifically denotes actions under fire. What Commander Cross was describing wasn't some desk job at a forgotten naval installation. It was operational combat experience at the highest levels of military service. Senator Whitmore, who'd been chatting comfortably with my father earlier in the evening about committee business and political donations, had moved closer to hear better. His expression had transformed from casual interest to intense attention. As someone who served on the Armed Services Committee, he understood better than most civilians in the room what the commander was actually describing. He was looking at me now with the kind of reassessment that happens when someone realizes they've completely misjudged a situation. Captain Whitmore picked up the narrative thread. Following her time with Naval Special Warfare Command, Lieutenant Commander Brennan was selected for the prestigious fellowship program at the Council on Foreign Relations, where she spent a year in New York conducting research on maritime security challenges in the Indo-Pacific region. Her policy recommendations were briefed to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and influenced current operational planning for the Pacific Fleet. Again, not the kind of work that gets discussed at yacht club dinners, but certainly the kind of contribution that shapes American naval strategy at the highest levels. I watched my father's face as each revelation landed. He was a man who'd spent his entire life understanding hierarchies, measuring success, evaluating worth through tangible achievements. The problem was that his entire framework for assessment had been built around the civilian business world where success was measured in profit margins, client lists, and social connections. He'd never developed the tools to properly evaluate military achievement, and in the absence of understanding, he'd simply assumed that anything outside his sphere of expertise must be less important than what he knew. Marcus had his phone out now, and I could see him frantically typing searches into Google, probably looking up what a Bronze Star with Valor actually meant, or trying to understand what the Council on Foreign Relations Fellowship represented in terms of professional prestige. His face was getting progressively redder as search results apparently contradicted everything he'd believed about his sister's lesser career path. The golden child was discovering that he might not have been the only high achiever in the family, and the realization was clearly causing him significant distress. Commander Cross pulled another document from his folder, this one bearing official seals and classification markings that were visible even from a distance. 2 years ago, Lieutenant Commander Brennan was selected to attend the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Not as a standard student, but as a distinguished fellow in the Strategy and Policy Department. She taught seminars to senior officers being groomed for flag rank, contributed to classified studies on future warfare scenarios, and completed her own research on hybrid threats in contested maritime spaces. Her work was briefed to the Secretary of the Navy and informed current policy decisions about fleet composition and forward deployment strategies. The implications were staggering. My father had been standing at a microphone talking about my need to come to my senses and join the real world while I'd actually been teaching senior naval officers and contributing to national security policy at levels that most civilians never encounter. The disconnect between his perception and reality wasn't just embarrassing. It was a fundamental indictment of how little attention he'd paid to my actual life and career. My mother had begun quietly crying, though I couldn't tell if the tears were from humiliation, regret, or some combination of emotions that came from discovering she'd been badly wrong about something central to her family narrative. Patricia Brennan had spent decades crafting an image of her family for public consumption, carefully managing what got shared and what got downplayed. The revelation that she'd been systematically minimizing achievements that would have been celebrated if they belonged to Marcus was forcing her to confront some uncomfortable truths about her own priorities and prejudices. Captain Whitmore had taken a step closer to the stage, and when she spoke again, her voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Brennan, I want to be very clear about something. Your daughter has spent the last 16 years serving in operational environments and strategic billets that most officers never see. She's been in combat. She's made life and death decisions. She's contributed to national security at levels that are classified well above anything you'd encounter in your shipping business, no matter how successful it might be. And throughout all of that, she's had to deal with family members who couldn't even be bothered to learn her correct rank, let alone understand what she was actually accomplishing." The rebuke was direct and unapologetic. Captain Whitmore wasn't trying to spare my father's feelings or preserve social niceties. She was stating facts with the bluntness of someone who'd watched talented officers struggle with family members who didn't value military service and had reached the limit of her patience with that particular brand of dismissal. Senator Whitmore had moved to stand beside my father, and I could see him speaking quietly into the older man's ear, probably explaining in political terms what was actually being described here. The senator's face suggested he was making it clear that this wasn't some minor career distinction being inflated for effect. This was legitimately impressive achievement that even someone with his years in Washington had to recognize as significant. Commander Cross wasn't finished. 6 months ago, Lieutenant Commander Brennan received notification of a promotion that only a tiny fraction of naval officers ever achieve. The selection was based on her operational record, her strategic contributions, and the consistent assessment from senior leadership that she possessed the qualities necessary for command at the highest levels. That promotion came with a change in assignment and an increase in security classification around her actual duties that makes it difficult to discuss specifics in an unclassified setting like this one. The room waited, everyone sensing that the other shoe was about to drop but not yet understanding what it would be. My father had gone very still, his earlier confidence completely evaporated, replaced by growing dread about what was coming next. He was a smart man, despite his blind spots about my career, and he was beginning to understand that Commander Cross had been building to something specific all along. The commander's next words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward to every corner of the ballroom. The promotion I'm referring to made Lieutenant Commander Brennan one of the youngest female flag officers in United States naval history. The correct way to address her now, Mr. Brennan, isn't Lieutenant or even Lieutenant Commander. It's Rear Admiral Lower Half Brennan. Or, more formally, Admiral Brennan. The title hung in the air, impossible to misunderstand or minimize. Rear Admiral. A one-star flag rank that placed me among the most senior leadership in the entire naval service. The kind of position that came with command of significant forces, responsibility for operations spanning multiple ships or installations, and authority that extended across vast geographic areas and thousands of personnel. This wasn't a respectable but modest career. This was the kind of achievement that represented the pinnacle of military service, recognition that someone had demonstrated exceptional ability across decades of increasingly responsible positions. My father's face had gone from pale to gray. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. Everything he'd said earlier in the evening, every dismissive comment about my career choices and my need to come to my senses, was being retroactively recontextualized in light of this revelation. He hadn't just been wrong about minor details. He'd been catastrophically, publicly, humiliatingly wrong about the fundamental nature of what I'd been doing with my life. Marcus had dropped his phone. The screen cracked when it hit the polished floor, but he didn't seem to notice. He was staring at me with an expression that combined shock, disbelief, and something that might have been the first stirring of actual respect he'd ever felt for his older sister. The golden child was discovering that someone else in the family had achieved something that rivaled or exceeded his own accomplishments, and in a domain he'd never bothered to take seriously because it existed outside his frame of reference. Maxwell Chen, the CEO who'd been comfortable attending his competitor's retirement party, was looking at me with the expression of someone rapidly recalculating social and professional equations. An admiral, even a newly promoted one-star, had access to levels of government and military leadership that could be valuable to a shipping company doing business in international waters where naval presence and policy mattered. I'd just gone from being Richard Brennan's disappointing daughter to being someone worth cultivating relationships with. The society wives who'd been photographing themselves with my mother earlier in the evening were frantically whispering to each other, probably already composing mental revisions to their social media posts that would need to reflect this new information. Patricia Brennan's daughter wasn't playing sailor after all. She was a flag officer, a member of the military elite, someone whose achievements actually exceeded what most of their children had accomplished in their various civilian careers. Captain Whitmore delivered the final blow with surgical precision. Admiral Brennan's promotion was accompanied by assignment to United States Fleet Cyber Command as Deputy Commander for Operations, overseeing offensive and defensive cyber operations across the Navy's global networks. She commands teams of officers and enlisted personnel whose work protects American interests in a domain that most civilians don't even understand exists in military terms. The operations she oversees are classified at the highest levels. The decisions she makes affect national security directly. And she's been doing this while her family couldn't even be bothered to learn her correct rank. The rebuke was devastating in its simplicity. While my father had been dismissing my career as respectable but modest, I'd been promoted to flag rank and given command of operations that directly defended American interests against sophisticated adversaries in cyberspace. While Marcus had been celebrating his junior partnership, I'd been leading teams in conflicts that would never make the news but that mattered enormously to national security. While my mother had been posting photographs of my brother's accomplishments, I'd been accumulating achievements she couldn't discuss publicly because they were classified. Senator Whitmore stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who actually understood what had just been revealed. Richard, I've served on the Armed Services Committee for 12 years. I've met hundreds of flag officers in that time. The promotion Admiral Brennan received is extraordinarily competitive. We're talking about selection rates below 5% for officers at her career stage. The fact that she achieved this at 34 makes her one of the most impressive success stories in recent naval history. You should be proud. Instead, you've spent the evening dismissing her career in front of 150 people who now understand that you had no idea what you were talking about. The senator's words carried weight that even my father couldn't dismiss. This wasn't some military person defending another service member. This was a United States senator with direct oversight of naval affairs explaining, in terms that everyone in the room could understand, that what had just been revealed wasn't some minor correction of facts. It was exposure of a fundamental failure to recognize genuine achievement because it existed outside the narrow parameters of what my family valued. My father finally found his voice, though it came out hoarse and uncertain. "Victoria, I didn't know. You never told us about any of this. How were we supposed to understand what you were doing if you didn't share this information with us?" The defense was weak and we both knew it. Commander Cross answered before I could speak, his tone brooking no disagreement. "Sir, Admiral Brennan has been promoted regularly throughout her career, consistent with her performance and potential. Every promotion was announced through official channels. Every significant assignment came with briefings for family members about what was permitted to be discussed. The information was available to you if you'd bothered to access it. The real question isn't why Admiral Brennan didn't tell you. It's why you never asked, never attended a promotion ceremony, never showed enough interest in her actual career to learn basic facts about her service." The accusation landed like a physical blow. My father had no defense because the commander was absolutely right. He'd never attended any of my promotion ceremonies, claiming business obligations or prior commitments. He'd never asked detailed questions about my assignments, satisfied with vague summaries that allowed him to construct whatever narrative he preferred. He'd never engaged with my career in any meaningful way because he'd already decided that it represented a disappointment rather than an achievement worth celebrating. My mother was openly weeping now, her carefully applied makeup running down her face in dark streaks. The image she'd worked so hard to project of the perfect family with perfect children had just been revealed as fiction built on willful ignorance and selective attention. Everyone in the room could see that she'd been so focused on promoting Marcus's achievements that she'd completely failed to recognize equally impressive accomplishments from her daughter. The ballroom had erupted into whispered conversations as people processed what they'd just witnessed. This was going to be the story that circulated through Harborview society for months, possibly years. The Brennan family retirement celebration where it was revealed that the disappointing daughter they'd been minimizing was actually a flag officer with achievements that exceeded anything their golden child had accomplished. The reversal of fortune was too dramatic, too complete, to be ignored or downplayed. Commander Cross carefully returned his documentation to his folder and looked directly at my father. "Mr. Brennan, you stood at that microphone and talked about legacy and building something meaningful. But legacy isn't just about businesses and money. It's about what you contribute to something larger than yourself. Your daughter has been contributing to the defense of this nation at the highest levels while you've been telling people she needs to come to her senses. The disconnect between your perception and reality tells us something important about what you actually value and what you've failed to recognize." The commander turned to face me, and for the first time that evening, his expression softened into something approaching warmth. "Admiral Brennan, on behalf of everyone who's had the privilege of serving with you, thank you for your dedication, your sacrifice, and your unwavering commitment to excellence. Some families understand what military service means. Others, apparently, need it explained to them by outsiders. Either way, your service stands on its own merit." He rendered a perfect salute, which I returned with equal precision. Captain Whitmore and the other officers who'd accompanied him did the same, creating a moment of formal military courtesy that stood in stark contrast to the casual dismissal I'd received from my father earlier in the evening. The gesture was simple but powerful, a public acknowledgement of respect and recognition from people whose opinions actually mattered in the world I'd chosen. The ballroom had gone silent again, everyone watching this exchange and understanding that they were witnessing something significant. The power dynamic that had defined the Brennan family for decades had just shifted irrevocably, and there was no way to restore the previous balance. My father's authority, built on business success and social connections, had been revealed as limited and parochial compared to achievements in service of something larger than personal ambition. Marcus had finally picked up his broken phone, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen from him before. Not quite respect, not quite admiration, but definitely a fundamental reassessment of who I was and what I represented. The golden child had just discovered that being the favorite didn't necessarily mean being the most successful, and that realization was clearly causing a significant recalibration of his self-image. Senator Whitmore placed a hand on my father's shoulder, and I could see him speaking quietly, probably offering political wisdom about how to manage this situation with minimal additional damage to reputation. But there was no managing this. Everyone in the room had heard what they'd heard. The story would spread through their networks immediately. By tomorrow morning, every member of Harborview society would know that Richard Brennan had publicly dismissed his daughter's naval career without realizing she'd achieved flag rank. My mother had risen from her chair and was moving toward me, her face a mess of running makeup and genuine distress. Whatever she'd imagined this evening would be, it certainly hadn't included having her parenting choices publicly scrutinized and found wanting by senior military officers in front of everyone whose opinion she valued. The perfect image she'd maintained for 3 decades had just shattered beyond repair. But as she reached me, I held up one hand to stop her approach. This wasn't the moment for tearful reconciliations or hasty apologies offered more to preserve appearances than from genuine understanding. What had been exposed tonight went far deeper than simple misunderstandings or communication failures. It was a pattern of dismissal and favoritism that had defined my entire childhood and young adulthood, choices my parents had made repeatedly to elevate my brother while minimizing my achievements. The evening that was supposed to celebrate my father's legacy had instead become a public accounting of the cost of that legacy. The price of building a business empire while failing to recognize what his own daughter had built in service to something larger than family profit. The consequences of measuring worth through narrow criteria that excluded entire categories of meaningful achievement. The revelation that sometimes the child you dismiss as disappointing is actually the one who exceeded every measure of success that matters beyond social circles and bank accounts. And this was only the beginning of what would unfold over the coming hours. The yacht club's terrace overlooked the harbor where sailboats rocked gently against their moorings, their masts creating a forest of vertical lines against the darkening sky. I'd stepped outside to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the ballroom, where conversations had fractured into a dozen urgent discussions about what had just unfolded. The salt air felt clean against my face, washing away some of the tension that had accumulated during Commander Cross's systematic dismantling of my family's comfortable mythology. Behind me, I could hear the muted chaos continuing inside. My father's retirement celebration had transformed into something entirely different, a social event that people would reference for years as the night when Richard Brennan discovered his assumptions about family hierarchy were built on sand. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I watched him standing near the bar surrounded by business associates who were clearly offering condolences or advice, their body language suggesting the kind of careful management that happens when someone powerful has just been publicly humbled. Uncle Frank found me on the terrace 20 minutes after the revelation. He was my father's older brother, though the two men had barely spoken in 15 years following a business dispute that had fractured their relationship beyond repair. Frank had taken a different path than his younger brother, enlisting in the Navy at 18 and spending 30 years rising through the enlisted ranks to retire as a Master Chief Petty Officer. Where Richard had built wealth and social connections, Frank had built character and an understanding of what actually mattered in life beyond quarterly earnings reports. He moved with the slightly rolling gait of someone who'd spent decades on ship decks, his frame still solid despite being in his late 60s. The civilian clothes he wore to the yacht club couldn't quite disguise his military bearing, and I'd always suspected that was partly intentional. Frank had never felt comfortable in spaces like this, where worth was measured in ways that had nothing to do with actual contribution or sacrifice. He came to stand beside me at the railing, looking out over the harbor without speaking immediately. That was Frank's way, comfortable with silence, understanding that some moments didn't require immediate commentary. Finally, he pulled a silver flask from his jacket pocket, took a long drink, and offered it to me with a slight smile. "Your father is having what my generation would call a come-to-Jesus moment in there," he said, his voice carrying the roughness of someone who'd shouted commands over engine noise and ocean storms for 3 decades. "I've watched him dismiss you since you were old enough to express opinions that differed from his plans. Seeing that finally catch up with him in front of his entire social world brings me more satisfaction than is probably Christian to admit." I accepted the flask and took a small sip, the whiskey burning pleasantly down my throat. Uncle Frank and I had maintained contact throughout my naval career despite my father's disapproval. He'd been at my academy graduation when my parents had claimed business obligations prevented their attendance. He'd sent letters during my deployments when my family's communication had been sporadic at best. He'd been the one Brennan family member who understood what military service actually meant and who'd celebrated my achievements without needing them explained or justified. "You knew about the promotion," I said. "It wasn't a question." He nodded, taking another drink from the flask before returning it to his pocket. "Got a call from an old shipmate who works personnel at the Pentagon. He wanted me to know that a Brennan was making flag rank. Figured I'd want to celebrate even if the rest of your family wouldn't understand what it meant. I've been waiting for tonight, honestly. Waiting for someone to finally force your father to confront what he's been too stubborn or too blind to see on his own." The harbor lights were beginning to reflect on the darkening water, creating shimmering pathways that led out toward the open ocean. I'd always loved this view, the sense of possibility that came from looking toward horizons that extended beyond the carefully manicured confines of places like the Harborview Yacht Club. It was what had drawn me to naval service in the first place, the understanding that there was a larger world beyond the one my parents inhabited, and that world needed people willing to serve something bigger than family business or social ambition. Uncle Frank continued, his voice taking on a reflective quality. "I watched your father build Brennan Logistics into what it is today. Can't deny he's got business talent and the kind of drive that builds empires. But somewhere along the way, he decided that his measure of success was the only valid one. Anyone who chose differently, who valued different things, must be making a mistake or settling for less. He did the same thing to me when I enlisted instead of going to college and joining the company. Took him 30 years to speak to me again, and even then it was only because your grandmother was dying and she made us promise to be civil at her funeral. The family history I'd only partially understood was coming into clearer focus. My father's dismissal of my career wasn't just about me or about military service specifically. It was part of a larger pattern of rigid thinking that couldn't accommodate paths that diverged from his narrow definition of achievement. Frank had been the first casualty of that worldview, pushed out of the family for choosing enlisted service over college and corporate success. I'd been the second, relegated to disappointing daughter status for following my own calling instead of Marcus's path through law school and eventual partnership in the family business. Through the terrace windows, I could see Marcus standing alone near the dessert table, his phone pressed to his ear in what looked like an intense conversation. His body language suggested distress, shoulders hunched forward and free hand gesturing emphatically as he spoke. I wondered who he was calling, whether he was seeking advice from law firm mentors about how to process having his self-image challenged, or perhaps talking to friends who could help him make sense of discovering his sister wasn't the underachiever he'd always assumed. Uncle Frank followed my gaze. "The golden child is having a rough night. Spent his whole life being told he was the successful one, the pride of the family, the one who got everything right. Now he's learning that success comes in forms he never bothered to understand. That's a hard lesson at 31, especially when you've built your entire identity around being superior to someone who just got revealed as your equal or better." The assessment was harsh but accurate. Marcus had never been intentionally cruel to me in the way some siblings torment each other. His dismissal of my career had been more casual, the kind of unconscious superiority that comes from genuinely believing you've chosen a better path. He'd pitted me more than he'd resented me, which in some ways was worse because it meant he'd never taken me seriously enough to see me as actual competition or worthy of real comparison. A commotion inside the ballroom drew our attention. My mother had cornered Captain Whitmore near the entrance, and even through the closed terrace doors, I could read the desperation in Patricia's body language. She was gesturing emphatically, her face still streaked with ruined makeup, clearly trying to extract information or perhaps seeking some way to reframe what had happened into something less damaging to her carefully constructed social image. Captain Whitmore's expression remained professional but cold, her responses brief and apparently unsatisfying based on my mother's increasingly agitated gestures. Finally, the captain said something that made my mother step back as if physically struck, then turned and walked away with the kind of decisive movement that communicated the conversation was over and would not be revisited. Uncle Frank made a low sound of approval. "Captain Whitmore doesn't suffer fools, never has. I served with her father back in the 80s, good man, taught his daughter not to waste time on people who value appearances over substance. Your mother is learning that military officers at that level don't particularly care about yacht club politics or social rehabilitation. They care about mission, capability, and character, none of which your family demonstrated much of tonight. The terrace door opened and Senator Whitmore stepped outside, his expression grave but not unkind. He'd removed his suit jacket and loosened his tie, the careful polish of his earlier appearance giving way to something more authentic and less performative. He nodded respectfully to Uncle Frank, clearly recognizing a fellow veteran despite the difference in their service experiences and current social positions. "Admiral Brennan," he said, using my rank naturally and without the awkwardness that civilians often display when addressing military officers by title. "I wanted to speak with you privately before the evening deteriorates further. Your father has asked me to help broker some kind of family reconciliation, but I told him that's not my place and frankly not possible tonight. What happened in that ballroom isn't something that gets fixed with apologies and quick conversations." I appreciated his directness. Senator Whitmore had built his political career on military affairs, and he understood the culture well enough to know that what had been exposed tonight went far deeper than simple misunderstandings. He gestured toward the railing and we moved to stand where we could speak without being overheard by the handful of other guests who'd migrated to the terrace seeking escape from the ballroom's uncomfortable atmosphere. The senator's voice dropped to a more confidential tone. "I've known your father for 12 years through various business councils and political fundraising events. He's a smart man and a successful one by conventional measures. But tonight revealed something I hadn't fully appreciated before, which is how completely he's failed to understand what's happening in your generation of military service. The Navy you're serving in, the operations you're conducting, the strategic challenges you're addressing, they're fundamentally different from what people like your Uncle Frank experienced during their service." Uncle Frank had moved closer to listen, and he nodded agreement with the senator's assessment. The Master Chief spoke with the authority of someone who'd witnessed the evolution firsthand. "When I joined up in '72, naval warfare was about big ships, big guns, and maintaining sea control through traditional means. By the time I retired in '02, we were already transitioning to network-centric warfare, precision strikes, and integrated joint operations. But even that doesn't capture what Victoria's generation is dealing with. Cyber warfare, space-based assets, autonomous systems, hybrid threats that don't fit traditional definitions of combat. Her father doesn't have the framework to understand any of it, so he defaulted to assuming it must be less important than what he knows." Senator Whitmore continued, his expression thoughtful. "The promotion you received puts you in an extremely select group. There are fewer than 200 flag officers in the entire Navy at any given time, and the average age for selection to Rear Admiral lower half is typically early to mid-40s. You made it at 34, which tells me that people far more qualified than your father to assess military talent see something exceptional in your record and potential. The assignments you've held, particularly the Cyber Command position, those are billets that shape how America projects power in the 21st century." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I sit on committees where we receive classified briefings about cyber threats, offensive capabilities, and the campaigns being waged in digital spaces that most Americans never hear about. I can't discuss specifics in this setting, but I can tell you that the work being done at Fleet Cyber Command is absolutely critical to national security. When your father stood at that microphone and suggested you needed to join the real world, he was displaying ignorance about what the real world actually looks like for modern military operations. The validation from someone with his perspective and access to classified information carried weight that civilian praise couldn't match." Senator Whitmore understood both worlds, the business and political sphere where my father operated and the military and national security realm where I'd built my career. His assessment that my achievements equaled or exceeded what Marcus had accomplished in corporate law wasn't empty courtesy. It was informed evaluation from someone positioned to make accurate comparisons. Uncle Frank pulled out his flask again and offered it around. The senator accepted with a slight smile, taking a drink before passing it to me. The three of us stood at the railing in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the harbor lights reflect on the water while behind us the wreckage of my father's retirement celebration continued to unfold. The senator eventually spoke again, his tone shifting to something more personal. "Admiral, I don't presume to give you advice about family matters. But I've seen enough of Washington politics and military culture to know that sometimes the most damaged relationships are the ones where fundamental respect was never established in the first place. Your father is going to want to repair things now that he understands what he got wrong. But you should be very clear with yourself about what repair would actually look like and whether it's possible given the history. Uncle Frank added his perspective with characteristic bluntness. Your father had 16 years to pay attention to your career. 16 years where he could have asked questions, attended ceremonies, shown basic interest in what you were doing with your life. He chose not to do any of that because he'd already decided your choices were disappointing. The fact that he's embarrassed now doesn't erase those 16 years of dismissal. Whatever relationship you build with him going forward, if any, needs to account for that history honestly rather than pretending it didn't happen. The terrace door opened again and Commander Cross emerged, scanning the space before spotting our small group. He approached with the economical movements of someone trained to operate efficiently in any environment, his expression suggesting he had information to share that couldn't wait for a more convenient moment. Admiral, he said, his formality indicating this was official communication rather than social conversation. I wanted to inform you before you hear it through other channels. Your father attempted to contact the base commander at Portsmouth about an hour ago, apparently seeking confirmation of your promotion and assignment. The duty officer referred his call to Public Affairs, who provided him with the standard biographical information we release about flag officers. He's also made several calls to business associates who have connections to the Pentagon, trying to understand how this could have happened without his knowledge. The news didn't surprise me, but it did confirm something important about my father's response to tonight's revelation. His first instinct hadn't been to apologize or to reflect on his failures as a parent. It had been to verify the information, to check whether what Commander Cross revealed was actually true or some kind of elaborate deception. Even now, faced with multiple witnesses and an audience of 150 people who'd heard the same information, his first response was skepticism rather than acceptance. Senator Whitmore's expression had darkened. That's unfortunately typical. People who've built their identity around being knowledgeable and well-connected often respond to revelations about their blind spots by questioning the information rather than examining their assumptions. Your father spent decades dismissing your career, and admitting he was wrong requires acknowledging that he was operating from ignorance and prejudice rather than informed assessment. That's difficult for proud men. Commander Cross continued his report. The Public Affairs Office also informed me that several media outlets have already reached out asking about tonight's incident. Someone in the ballroom apparently shared information on social media, and it's generated interest because of the unusual circumstances. A flag officer being publicly revealed at a civilian event, family not knowing her rank, the dramatic correction by senior officers, it's the kind of human interest story that plays well. Public Affairs is preparing a statement that confirms your rank and assignment without addressing family dynamics specifically. Uncle Frank let out a low whistle. So not only did Richard humiliate himself in front of his social circle, but the story is going to spread beyond Harborview. That's going to be hard for a man who's spent his life carefully managing his public image. The business community, the political donors, the yacht club crowd, they're all going to know that he was so disconnected from his own daughter that he didn't know she'd made Admiral. The implications were significant. My father's reputation had been built partly on his image as a successful family man, someone who balanced business achievement with supposedly strong personal relationships. The revelation that he'd been so inattentive to his daughter's career that he'd publicly misrepresented her rank and accomplishments would undermine that carefully cultivated image. People would question what else he might be wrong about, whether his judgment could be trusted if he couldn't even accurately assess his own family. Senator Whitmore placed a hand on my shoulder with paternal warmth that my own father had rarely displayed. Admiral, whatever happens with your family, please know that your service is valued and recognized by people who actually understand what you've accomplished. The military and intelligence communities, the people who work in national security, we know what flag officers at Fleet Cyber Command are doing and why it matters. Your father's ignorance doesn't diminish your achievements in any way. The senator's phone buzzed and he glanced at the screen, his expression suggesting the message was urgent. He excused himself with apologies and headed back inside, leaving me with Uncle Frank and Commander Cross. The three of us stood in companionable silence for a moment, military people comfortable with not filling every pause with conversation. Commander Cross eventually spoke, his tone less formal now that the official business was concluded. "Admiral, I've served with a lot of talented officers over my career. What struck me about your record wasn't just the achievements, though those are impressive. It was the consistent pattern of choosing difficult assignments over easy ones, operational billets over career-enhancing staff positions, substance over appearance. That's rare at any level, but especially rare among officers being groomed for flag rank where there's enormous pressure to play it safe and avoid controversy." Uncle Frank nodded agreement. "That's the Brennan stubbornness coming through, though in Victoria's case it's actually a strength rather than the liability it is for her father. Richard's stubbornness makes him rigid and unable to adapt when his assumptions are challenged. Victoria's stubbornness made her stick with what she believed in even when her family was telling her she was making a mistake. Different applications of the same family trait. The observation was insightful and somewhat uncomfortable. I'd spent years trying to differentiate myself from my father, to prove that I wasn't cut from the same cloth that produced his particular brand of achievement-focused tunnel vision. But Uncle Frank was right that we shared certain characteristics, including a determination to pursue our chosen paths regardless of external pressure or criticism. The difference was what we'd chosen to be stubborn about and what values drove our decision-making. Through the terrace windows, I could see my mother sitting alone at one of the small cocktail tables, her posture suggesting complete defeat. The carefully maintained image she'd projected for 3 decades had shattered tonight, and everyone who mattered in her social world had witnessed the collapse. Patricia Brennan had built her identity around being the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect representative of old New England family values. The revelation that she'd been so focused on promoting Marcus while dismissing my achievements had exposed her as someone whose maternal instincts were corrupted by favoritism and whose judgment was clouded by prejudice. Uncle Frank followed my gaze and his voice softened slightly. "Your mother is going to have the harder time with this than your father. Richard can retreat into business and rationalize what happened as a communication failure or a result of your security clearances limiting what you could share. But Patricia built her entire social identity around family, and tonight revealed that she didn't actually know her own daughter. That's going to haunt her in ways that business setbacks won't haunt your father." Commander Cross checked his watch and indicated it was time for him to return to his duties. Before leaving, he rendered a crisp salute that I returned, then offered a final piece of wisdom. "Admiral, your family is going to want things to go back to normal quickly, to smooth over tonight and pretend it was just an unfortunate misunderstanding. Don't let them do that. What happened tonight revealed truths that need to be addressed honestly if there's going to be any genuine relationship going forward. Normal wasn't working. It was just comfortable for them." He departed, leaving me alone on the terrace with Uncle Frank. The evening had grown cooler and the harbor was now fully dark except for the navigation lights on anchored boats and the glow from waterfront restaurants. Inside the ballroom, the retirement celebration had devolved into something between a wake and a scandal, with guests clustered in small groups processing what they'd witnessed. Uncle Frank pulled his flask out one more time, offering it to me with a slight smile. "To family," he said with ironic emphasis. "May we eventually build the ones we deserve rather than the ones we're born into." I drank, the whiskey warming me against the ocean breeze. The toast captured something essential about the evening's events. My biological family had revealed themselves as fundamentally unable or unwilling to see me clearly, to value what I'd achieved, to celebrate who I'd become. But I'd built another family over 16 years of service, composed of people like Uncle Frank, Commander Cross, Captain Whitmore, and countless others who understood what dedication to something larger than personal ambition actually meant. The door opened once more and Marcus stepped onto the terrace. His earlier confidence had been replaced by something that looked like genuine confusion and distress. He approached slowly, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his expensive suit somehow looking less impressive than it had at the start of the evening. He stopped a few feet away, seemingly unsure how to begin whatever conversation he'd come out here to have. Uncle Frank studied him for a moment, then nodded to me and headed inside, leaving us alone to navigate whatever confrontation or reconciliation my brother had in mind. Marcus stood silent for a long moment before finally speaking, his voice lacking its usual certainty. "I googled everything they said about you in there. The Bronze Star. The War College. The Cyber Command position. The flag rank. I didn't understand half of what I was reading, but even I could tell that what you've done is extraordinary. And I had no idea. None. I've spent years thinking I was the successful one while you were just doing okay at some middle management military job. The admission hung between us, honest in a way that my brother rarely allowed himself to be. His entire self-image had been constructed around being the family's great success, and discovering that assessment was based on ignorance rather than accurate comparison had clearly shaken him profoundly. I waited for him to continue, curious where this uncharacteristic vulnerability would lead and whether it represented genuine growth or just temporary discomfort that would fade once he processed the shock. What Marcus said next would determine whether the evening's revelations could begin healing our fractured family relationships, or whether they would simply add new layers of resentment to decades of accumulated damage. Marcus stood on the terrace struggling with words that clearly didn't come naturally to him. His hands kept moving from his pockets to adjusting his tie to running through his hair, nervous gestures from someone accustomed to controlling conversations rather than fumbling through them. The confident lawyer who'd stood in the ballroom earlier accepting accolades about his junior partnership had been replaced by someone considerably less certain about his place in the world. He finally managed to continue, his voice rough with emotion I'd never heard from him before. I've been calling you Lieutenant for years. Not because I was trying to be dismissive, or at least I didn't think I was, but because that's what Dad told me your rank was and I never questioned it. I never asked you directly. I never looked it up. I just accepted his version because it fit with how I wanted to see things. You were the one who chose differently, who went a different path, and in my head that meant you were doing okay but not great. It meant I could feel superior without being cruel about it. The self-awareness was startling coming from Marcus, who'd built his identity on being right about things and rarely admitted uncertainty about anything. His legal training had reinforced natural tendencies toward advocacy and argumentation, making him someone who defended positions rather than questioning them. Watching him grapple with fundamental errors in his worldview was uncomfortable but also genuine in ways our relationship had rarely been. I kept my voice neutral, not wanting to make this easier for him but also curious where his confession would lead. You called me a glorified secretary last Thanksgiving. You said I was pushing papers at some obscure base while you were handling cases worth millions of dollars. You said it in front of everyone at dinner, and Dad laughed. Mom changed the subject. Nobody corrected you because nobody actually knew what I was doing. Marcus winced at the memory, his face flushing with embarrassment that looked authentic rather than performative. I remember that. I thought it was funny. I thought I was just stating obvious facts about our different career trajectories. But you were already running operations that I still don't fully understand even after spending the last hour reading articles about cyber warfare and fleet command structures. You were literally defending the country while I was helping shipping companies structure contracts to minimize tax liability. He moved to lean against the terrace railing, staring out at the harbor rather than looking at me directly. The posture reminded me suddenly of our father, the same way of positioning his body to avoid direct confrontation while still engaging in difficult conversations. Some family patterns ran deeper than conscious choice. Marcus continued, his voice taking on an edge of frustration that seemed directed at himself. The worst part is that I had opportunities to know better. You invited me to your promotion ceremony 3 years ago when you made lieutenant commander. I told you I had a deposition scheduled and couldn't make it. That was true, but I also didn't try very hard to reschedule. It was easier to stay in Boston working on my cases than to drive down to Portsmouth for a military ceremony I didn't think was particularly important. And you never pushed, never insisted, just said you understood and maybe next time. The memory surfaced with painful clarity. I'd sent him a formal invitation 6 weeks in advance, included all the details about timing and location, even offered to arrange lodging if he wanted to stay overnight. His email declining had been brief and professional, expressing regret but citing work obligations that couldn't be moved. I'd told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need my family's validation to know my achievements were meaningful. But standing here now listening to him acknowledge the choice he'd made, I realized how much that absence had hurt even if I'd never admitted it. Your next words could have been angry or accusatory, but instead you found yourself asking a question you'd never directly posed. Why did you think Dad's assessment of my career was accurate? You're a lawyer. You're trained to verify information and challenge assumptions. But you never questioned whether his version of my service was complete or correct. Marcus turned to face me directly for the first time, and his expression was complex. Guilt, certainly, but also something that looked like dawning comprehension of patterns he'd never examined before. Because questioning Dad's version would have meant questioning a lot of other things too. It would have meant wondering if I was really the golden child or just the one whose achievements were easier for him to understand and claim credit for. It would have meant examining whether the favoritism we both knew existed was actually fair or justified. It was simpler to accept that his assessment of both of us was accurate rather than considering that he might be wrong about fundamental things. The admission cut deeper than simple apologies could have. Marcus was acknowledging not just that he'd been wrong about me, but that he'd been complicit in maintaining a family dynamic that served his interests even as it diminished mine. The golden child role he'd occupied his entire life hadn't been purely accidental or based solely on his achievements. It had been sustained partly through his willingness to accept narratives that elevated him at my expense, to not ask questions that might complicate his favored status. A burst of laughter from inside the ballroom drew both our attention. Through the windows we could see a group of younger guests clustered around someone's phone, apparently watching something on the screen that they found entertaining. Marcus's expression darkened as he watched them, clearly understanding that the evening's events were already being transformed into social media content that would spread far beyond the yacht club's immediate social circle. He turned back to me with renewed urgency. "Victoria, I need you to understand something. What happened in there tonight, that wasn't just embarrassing for Dad. It revealed things about our whole family that people are going to talk about for years. The way he dismissed you, the way Mom never corrected him, the way I went along with it all, we're all going to be judged for that. And honestly, we deserve to be. But I'm asking you to consider what happens next. How we handle this as a family going forward." The shift from confession to negotiation was swift, revealing that Marcus's lawyer instincts were still operating even in this moment of apparent vulnerability. He was already thinking about damage control, about managing the narrative, about finding ways to minimize the long-term impact on the Brennan family reputation. It wasn't entirely cynical, his concerns seemed genuine, but it also showed that his primary frame of reference remained strategic management of problems rather than genuine moral reckoning. I kept my voice level and direct. "What happens next isn't something we handle as a family, Marcus. What happens next is that I continue doing my job while you all figure out how to process the fact that your assumptions about me were wrong. I don't owe you a smooth path to redemption. I don't owe Dad a graceful way to save face. And I certainly don't owe Mom help managing her social embarrassment about having dismissed her daughter's achievements for 16 years. Marcus looked stricken, but he didn't immediately argue, which suggested the evening's revelations had genuinely shaken his usual confidence about how to handle difficult situations. He stood silent for a moment before trying a different approach. "I'm not asking you to make this easy for us. I'm asking what you need from us to even begin rebuilding some kind of relationship. Because right now it feels like the family is fractured in ways that might be permanent, and I'm trying to understand if that's what you want or if there's any path forward." The question was more honest than I'd expected from him, acknowledging that repair wasn't automatic and that I held significant power in determining what any future relationship might look like. It was the kind of question he should have asked years ago, but the fact that he was asking it now suggested tonight had genuinely altered something in how he understood family dynamics and his role in perpetuating dysfunction. Before I could answer, the terrace door opened and my father stepped outside. Richard Brennan looked like he'd aged a decade in the past 2 hours. His earlier confidence and satisfaction had been completely stripped away, replaced by something that looked like genuine distress. His face was pale despite the warmth of the evening, and his movements lacked their usual decisive quality. He saw Marcus and me standing together and hesitated, clearly uncertain whether he should interrupt or retreat. Marcus made the decision for him. "Dad, I think you need to talk to Victoria. Actually talk, not tell her what you think or explain why you were right to make assumptions. Just listen for once." The rebuke from his favored child seemed to hit my father harder than anything Commander Cross had said in the ballroom. Richard flinched visibly, then nodded and moved to join us at the railing. Marcus gave my shoulder a brief squeeze that might have been meant as support or solidarity, then retreated inside, leaving me alone with the man whose approval I'd stopped seeking years ago but whose disapproval had still shaped so much of my life. My father stood silent for a long moment, seeming to gather himself for a conversation he clearly dreaded. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its usual authority. "Victoria, I don't know how to begin apologizing for what happened tonight. For what I said, for what it revealed about how little I've paid attention to your actual life and career. I've spent the last hour having business associates and political contacts explain to me what I should have already known about my own daughter's achievements. That's humiliating, but it's also clarifying in ways I'm still processing." The apology was more substantive than I'd expected, acknowledging not just the immediate incident but the longer pattern of inattention that had led to it. I studied his face, looking for signs of whether this represented genuine understanding or strategic contrition meant to quickly resolve an uncomfortable situation. What I saw was complex, a mixture of authentic distress and the businessman's instinct to solve problems efficiently. I responded carefully, choosing words that would require him to engage with specifics rather than allowing him to remain in comfortable generalities. "Dad, you told 150 people that I needed to come to my senses and join the real world. You said that while I was literally commanding operations that defend American interests against sophisticated adversaries. You've been telling versions of that story for 16 years, to family, to business associates, to anyone who asked about your children. What exactly are you apologizing for? The specific words tonight, or the fundamental failure to see me accurately that those words represented?" He absorbed the question like a physical blow, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Both," he said quietly. "All of it. I built a narrative about your career based on assumptions and limited information, and then I defended that narrative rather than questioning whether it was accurate. I told myself that if your achievements were really significant, you'd share more details or invite us to more events. But Commander Cross was right. You did invite us to ceremonies. You did try to explain what you were doing within the limits of what was classified. I just didn't prioritize attending or really listening because I'd already decided that military service was less valuable than business success." The admission was more complete than I'd anticipated, acknowledging active choices rather than just passive oversight. My father was confronting the fact that his ignorance about my career hadn't been accidental or inevitable. It had resulted from decisions about where to focus his attention and what achievements to celebrate, decisions that had consistently favored Marcus's civilian career over my military service. I pressed further, needing to understand whether he grasped the full implications. "Why did you decide military service was less valuable? Uncle Frank served for 30 years and you barely spoke to him for most of that time. I served for 16 years and you consistently diminish my choices in favor of Marcus's career. What is it about military service that you can't respect or won't acknowledge as legitimate achievement?" My father's face worked through several expressions before settling on something that looked like painful self-examination. He moved to sit on one of the terrace benches, suddenly seeming exhausted in ways that went beyond the late hour or the evening's social disaster. His answer, when it came, was halting but honest in ways he rarely allowed himself to be. "I think it's because military achievement exists outside my realm of influence and understanding. In business, I can evaluate success through metrics I comprehend. Revenue, profit margins, market share, client relationships. I know what it takes to build those things and I can accurately assess when someone does it well. But military service, especially at the levels you've operated at, it uses entirely different measures of worth that I don't have the tools to evaluate. So rather than admitting my ignorance or developing new frameworks for assessment, I defaulted to assuming that anything I couldn't measure must be less important than what I could." The psychological insight was more acute than I'd given him credit for. Richard Brennan had built his entire identity around being knowledgeable and competent in his domain, and confronting areas where that expertise didn't transfer threatened his self-image more than he could comfortably manage. Rather than expanding his understanding to encompass different forms of achievement, he'd narrowed his definition of success to exclude anything outside his area of mastery. He continued, his voice growing stronger as he worked through ideas that had clearly been forming during his difficult evening. "With Marcus, I could understand every step of his career progression. The law school applications, the firm interviews, the cases he worked on, the partnership track. I could offer advice, make introductions, feel like I was contributing to his success. But with you, every time I asked about your work, you'd mention classifications or operational security or information I wasn't cleared to know. It made me feel irrelevant to your success, and I responded by convincing myself that your success must be less substantial than Marcus's because I couldn't participate in it or claim any credit for enabling it. The confession revealed an ugliness in his motivations that was difficult to hear but important to understand. Part of his dismissal of my career had stemmed from wounded pride about being unable to help or guide me in the ways he'd assisted Marcus. His need to feel essential to his children's achievements had made him devalue accomplishments that didn't require his input or couldn't be enhanced through his business connections. I sat down on the bench beside him, maintaining some distance but acknowledging that this conversation required more than standing at opposite ends of the terrace. My voice was steady but not cold. Dad, I'm 34 years old. I've been deployed to combat zones. I've led teams through situations where people could die if I made the wrong decisions. I've contributed to national security operations that will never be publicly acknowledged. I don't need you to understand everything I've done or to feel like you contributed to my success. But I did need you to respect that what I was doing had value even if you couldn't measure it through your business metrics. He nodded slowly, tears visible in his eyes for the first time I could remember in my adult life. Richard Brennan didn't cry. He solved problems, made decisions, moved forward. Seeing him actually feeling the weight of what he'd done, what he'd failed to do, was disorienting in ways I was still processing. His next words came out rough with emotion. I've wasted 16 years being proud of the wrong things and dismissive of achievements I should have been celebrating. I told everyone about Marcus making junior partner, but I couldn't tell them you'd made Admiral because I didn't know. I didn't know because I never asked the right questions or paid enough attention to learn the answers. That's not a failure of information access. That's a failure of love and basic parental responsibility. The acknowledgement of love, or the failure of it, hung between us weighted with decades of complicated history. My relationship with my father had always been transactional rather than affectionate, based on meeting expectations rather than unconditional acceptance. Hearing him frame his failures in terms of love rather than just attention or understanding suggested he was grappling with something deeper than social embarrassment about tonight's revelations. Inside the ballroom, I could see the party had essentially dissolved. Most guests had departed, leaving only a core group of close family friends and business associates who were apparently helping my mother coordinate cleanup and manage the aftermath. Patricia was visible through the windows, still looking devastated but now engaged in the familiar comfort of managing logistics and social details. Even in crisis, she retreated to what she knew. My father followed my gaze and his voice took on additional weight. Your mother is taking this even harder than I am. She built her entire identity around being a good mother, raising successful children, representing family values to the community. Tonight revealed that she was so focused on promoting Marcus that she completely failed to recognize equally impressive achievements from you. That's going to haunt her in ways that will take years to process, if she ever fully does. The observation was accurate, but I felt limited sympathy for my mother's distress. Patricia Brennan had made choices throughout my childhood and adult life that consistently prioritized appearance over authenticity, Marcus's needs over mine, social reputation over genuine relationship. The consequences of those choices catching up with her didn't erase the damage they'd caused or obligate me to make her emotional recovery easier. I stood up from the bench, signaling that this initial conversation was reaching its conclusion. My voice was firm but not cruel. Dad, I appreciate that you're beginning to understand what you got wrong. But understanding isn't the same as changing. If you want any kind of relationship with me going forward, it can't be built on the same foundation as before. You can't measure my worth through frameworks that don't apply to military service. You can't compare my achievements to Marcus's as if we're competing in the same arena. And you can't expect me to make this easy by pretending the last 16 years didn't happen the way they did. He nodded acceptance, though his expression suggested he didn't fully grasp yet what genuine change would require from him. Richard Brennan was accustomed to solving problems through decisive action and strategic thinking, but family relationships damaged by decades of neglect couldn't be repaired through business tactics or quick fixes. The work ahead would require sustained effort, uncomfortable self-examination, and acceptance that some damage might be permanent regardless of his intentions. Before I could say more, Captain Whitmore appeared at the terrace door with an expression that suggested she had information requiring my immediate attention. She approached with purposeful strides, nodding respectfully to my father but focusing her communication on me. "Admiral Brennan, I apologize for interrupting, but we've received word that the media interest in tonight's events is accelerating beyond initial expectations. Several major outlets are requesting interviews, and the Navy's Public Affairs Office wants guidance on how to handle the inquiries." My father's face paled further, clearly understanding that what he'd hoped might remain a private family matter contained within Harborview's social circles was instead becoming a public story that would reach audiences far beyond the yacht club. Richard Brennan had spent his career carefully managing his public image, and the loss of control over this narrative was probably more disturbing to him than the personal failures the story would expose. Captain Whitmore continued, her tone professional but not unsympathetic. "The story has compelling elements that appeal to media coverage. Female admiral, family unaware of her achievements, dramatic revelation at social event, broader questions about how military service is valued versus civilian careers. It's the kind of human interest angle that resonates beyond typical military news. The Public Affairs Office is prepared to handle this appropriately, but they need to know your preferences regarding personal details and family aspects. I considered the implications carefully. The story going public would increase pressure on my family but would also create opportunities to highlight issues that mattered beyond our personal dynamics. The broader questions about how military service is perceived and valued, the challenges female officers face in getting their achievements recognized, the gaps between civilian and military cultures, these were conversations worth having even if they came at personal cost." My father found his voice, though it came out strained. "Victoria, please, is there any way to contain this? To keep the family aspects private? I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but the business implications alone could be significant if this becomes a major news story." The request revealed that even in this moment of apparent breakthrough, his instincts still ran toward reputation management and damage control rather than genuine moral accountability. He was more concerned about business implications than about addressing the fundamental relationship failures tonight had exposed. The prioritization was sadly typical and reinforced my sense that whatever changes he might make would be limited and superficial rather than transformative. I met his eyes directly, my voice carrying the command authority that came naturally now after years of making decisions under pressure. "Dad, the story is already public. The question isn't whether it gets told, but what version of it reaches the broader audience. I can either participate in shaping that narrative to highlight issues that matter beyond our family, or I can stay silent and let others tell whatever version they construct from available information. Either way, what happened tonight has consequences that extend beyond your comfort or your business concerns." Captain Whitmore added context that made the choice clearer. "Admiral, the Chief of Naval Operations Office has indicated they would support your participation in media coverage if you choose to engage. They see this as an opportunity to discuss the evolution of naval warfare, the increasing importance of cyber operations, and the contributions of female flag officers. Your story could serve larger purposes than just personal vindication." The suggestion aligned with how I'd been thinking about the situation. What happened tonight was embarrassing for my family and validating for me personally, but it also illustrated disconnects between military and civilian cultures that had broader implications for national security, recruitment, and public understanding of what modern defense actually entails. If my personal story could serve as a vehicle for those larger conversations, the discomfort of public exposure might be worthwhile. My father was watching this exchange with growing comprehension that he'd lost any ability to control or contain the narrative. His lifetime of carefully managing information, cultivating relationships, and shaping how the Brennan family was perceived had led to this moment where his daughter was calmly discussing how to use his humiliation as a teaching opportunity for national audiences. The reversal of power was complete and irreversible. I turned back to Captain Whitmore with decision made. "Please inform Public Affairs that I'm willing to participate in appropriate media coverage focused on the professional aspects, the broader cultural issues, and the importance of recognizing military service accurately. I'll leave the specific family dynamics private to the extent possible, but I won't pretend tonight's revelation was anything other than what it was, a father discovering he'd fundamentally misunderstood his daughter's career because he'd never bothered to look beyond his own assumptions." The captain nodded approval and stepped away to make the necessary communications, leaving me alone again with my father on the terrace. The harbor had grown fully dark now, only navigation lights and the glow from distant shore marking the boundaries between water and sky. The evening that had begun with his retirement celebration had transformed into something neither of us could have anticipated, and we were both still processing the magnitude of that transformation. Richard Brennan spoke quietly, his voice stripped of its usual confidence. I suppose I deserve to be the cautionary tale in whatever story gets told. The successful businessman who was too blind to see his own daughter's achievements. That's going to be my legacy now, overshadowing whatever I built with Brennan Logistics. I didn't offer reassurance because he was probably right. Whatever business success he'd achieved would be footnoted by this revelation in ways that would follow him through whatever remained of his public life. But that consequence was self-inflicted, the natural result of choices he'd made repeatedly over 16 years. My responsibility wasn't to protect him from those consequences but to ensure they served some constructive purpose beyond personal vindication. The terrace door opened one more time and my mother stepped out, having finally gathered courage to face me directly. Her makeup was beyond repair and she'd stopped trying to fix it, leaving tracks of mascara visible on her cheeks. Patricia Brennan looked smaller somehow, diminished by the collapse of the image she'd maintained so carefully for so long. She approached slowly, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Victoria, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know how to ask for forgiveness for something this fundamental. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. Not just for tonight, but for every time I minimized your achievements, every time I changed the subject when people asked about your service, every time I prioritized Marcus's needs and accomplishments over yours. I told myself I was just being a supportive mother to both of you in different ways, but tonight made me see that was a lie I told myself to avoid confronting my own prejudices and failures. The apology was more complete than anything my father had managed, acknowledging specific behaviors and their impact rather than remaining in comfortable abstractions. My mother had always been more emotionally aware than my father, better at reading social dynamics and understanding relationship undercurrents. That awareness made her failures more culpable in some ways, because they'd been more conscious choices rather than simple blindness. What happened next would determine whether tonight marked the beginning of genuine family transformation or just a temporary disruption before old patterns reasserted themselves. My mother stood waiting for my response, her vulnerability genuine but also calculated in the way that came from decades of managing social situations through emotional intelligence. Patricia Brennan understood that this moment required more than surface apologies, but I could also see her struggling with how much authentic emotion to display versus how much control to maintain. Even in crisis, her instincts ran toward performance. I looked between my parents, seeing them clearly perhaps for the first time without the filters of childhood need for approval or adult resentment at its absence. They were flawed people who'd built impressive external success while failing catastrophically at understanding their own daughter. The revelation tonight hadn't created that failure. It had simply exposed what had existed for 16 years. My response was measured and honest. Mom, Dad, I appreciate that you're beginning to understand what went wrong. But understanding isn't transformation. You've both spent this evening apologizing for specific incidents while the real issue is the fundamental framework you use to evaluate worth and distribute attention. Marcus succeeded in your eyes because he chose a path you could comprehend and participate in. I didn't fail in any objective sense. I just succeeded in ways that didn't validate your worldview or enhance your social standing. My father started to protest, but I continued, my voice carrying the authority that came from years of making decisions that affected operations and lives. If we're going to have any relationship going forward, it needs to be built on completely different foundations. You need to accept that military achievement is neither superior nor inferior to civilian success, just different. You need to recognize that classifications and operational security aren't excuses I invented to avoid sharing details, they're real constraints on what can be discussed. And most importantly, you need to understand that my worth isn't determined by whether you can measure or claim credit for my accomplishments. My mother nodded slowly, tears flowing freely now. You're right. About all of it. I don't know if we can change enough to deserve a real relationship with you, but I want to try. Even if that process takes years and involves facing uncomfortable truths about ourselves. The admission was more than I'd expected, acknowledging that repair wasn't guaranteed and would require sustained effort rather than quick fixes. Patricia had always been strategic about relationships, but there was something in her tone that suggested genuine willingness to do difficult work rather than just manage appearances. Through the terrace windows, I could see Marcus speaking with Uncle Frank, both of them engaged in what looked like serious conversation. My brother's body language had shifted from his earlier defensive posture to something more open, actually listening rather than preparing counterarguments. Uncle Frank was gesturing toward the harbor, probably sharing stories from his own naval service, giving Marcus context he'd never sought before about what military life actually entailed. Captain Whitmore returned with an update, her expression suggesting positive developments. Admiral, the Public Affairs Office has coordinated with several outlets for interviews tomorrow. They've also been contacted by a documentary team interested in broader stories about female flag officers and the evolution of naval warfare. Your decision to engage is already creating opportunities for conversations that extend well beyond tonight's events. Senator Whitmore had followed the captain onto the terrace, and he added his perspective with the weight of someone who understood both military and political implications. Victoria, what happened tonight is unfortunate for your family but valuable for the country. Too many Americans have no understanding of what modern military service involves or what kinds of threats our forces address daily. Your willingness to discuss these issues publicly, even at personal cost, serves the national interest in ways that matter beyond family dynamics. My father absorbed this with visible difficulty, understanding that his daughter's story would be told whether he liked it or not, and that her choices would be framed as serving larger purposes while his failures would be used as cautionary examples. The businessman who'd spent decades controlling narratives was learning that some stories escaped management regardless of resources or connections. Uncle Frank and Marcus had moved to join our group on the terrace, expanding the family circle to include everyone whose presence tonight had mattered. Frank placed a supportive hand on my shoulder, his pride visible in ways my father's approval had never been. Marcus stood slightly apart, still processing but clearly changed by the evening's revelations in ways that might prove lasting. I addressed all of them together, wanting clarity about what came next. I'm going to participate in media coverage that uses tonight's story to discuss issues that matter beyond our family. I'm going to continue serving at Fleet Cyber Command without worrying about whether my family understands or approves of my work. And I'm going to build whatever relationships with each of you that prove sustainable based on genuine respect rather than obligation or social convention. My mother reached for my hand tentatively, and I allowed the contact without pulling away. She spoke softly but clearly. We'll do better. We'll learn. We'll earn whatever relationship you're willing to give us, even if that takes the rest of our lives. My father added his commitment with the decisiveness that had built his business success. I'm going to attend your next promotion ceremony, whenever that happens. I'm going to learn enough about naval operations to ask intelligent questions about your work within classification limits. And I'm going to make very clear to everyone in our business and social circles that you're the family's greatest achievement, not its disappointment. Marcus stepped forward with characteristic directness. I'm going to stop measuring success through narrow civilian metrics. I'm going to actually talk to Uncle Frank about his service instead of dismissing it as less important than my legal career. And I'm going to be the brother you deserve to have 16 years ago, even though I can't recover that lost time. The commitments were more specific than I'd anticipated, suggesting tonight had genuinely shaken something loose in my family's understanding of themselves and their values. Whether those commitments would translate into sustained behavioral change remained to be seen, but the fact that they were being articulated at all represented progress. Senator Whitmore spoke with the gravity of someone issuing official recognition. Admiral Brennan, on behalf of the Armed Services Committee and personally, thank you for your service and your willingness to help bridge the gap between military and civilian communities. Your story is going to reach people who need to hear it. Captain Whitmore rendered a final salute that I returned, then she and the senator departed to handle the various coordination requirements that came with managing a story that was rapidly spreading beyond the yacht club's confines. Uncle Frank gave me a fierce hug before following them inside, leaving me alone on the terrace with my immediate family. The harbor stretched dark before us, navigation lights marking safe passages through waters that had been traveled by generations of sailors pursuing different destinies. My family stood together in uncomfortable silence, all of us understanding that something fundamental had shifted tonight but uncertain exactly what shape the future would take. My father spoke quietly, his voice stripped of pretension. I love you, Victoria. I should have said that more often without conditions attached. Without it being contingent on you meeting expectations I had no right to impose. My mother added her own truth. You've always been extraordinary. I'm sorry it took public humiliation for us to finally see clearly what was right in front of us. Marcus finished the circle of acknowledgement with characteristic honesty. You're not the disappointing daughter. You never were. We were the disappointing family. I absorbed their words, feeling something in my chest that might have been the beginning of forgiveness or might just have been exhaustion from carrying decades of resentment. Whatever relationships we built going forward would be different from what we'd had before, constructed on honest foundations rather than convenient fictions. The evening that had begun with my father's retirement celebration had ended with the retirement of old family dynamics that no longer served anyone. What emerged from tonight's wreckage remained to be written, but for the first time in my adult life, I felt like the story might actually be worth telling. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.